This video will go over guidance on facilitation skills, or how to train. The content of this is built around GBVIMS or GBVIMS+, but the principles are applicable to other topics. So we'll be talking today about 4 high-level topics. What I want you to take away from this training is what skills and characteristics will make you a good trainer, how you can set up your environment to facilitate learning, how to do the detailed parts of planning and implementation, a checklist for that, and how to effectively engage and communicate with participants. First, let's talk about skills and characteristics. So, what are the skills and characteristics of a good trainer? I want to start with helping you think about the opposite. I once had a math teacher who used to tell his students, sometimes you just hit a wall and you can't learn any more about a topic. And even if it wasn't directed at you, imagine the impact of hearing that kind of message. It's disempowering, it gives a sense of limitation, not possibility. Can you think of a time when you had a really poor teacher? What was your outcome? A negative learning experience impacts students, participants, and learners in significant ways. That's why it's really important that not only are we specialists in the content we're teaching, but also that we bring the right skills and characteristics to teaching. If you want to get your message across, your attitude and the way you approach teaching will have a big impact on how your messages will be received. These are some of the skills of good trainers. They're patient, accepting, inclusive, enabling. They have a good sense of humor. They're encouraging, confident, generous, motivating, good listeners. What do you think about this list? Is there anything missing that you would add? One way to think about this list is in terms of the roles that trainers are expected to play, and there's a lot of them. Sometimes you need to be a cheerleader in encouraging others. Sometimes you need to mediate or be a referee among participants. And you also need to build trust and acceptance and inspire learners. Let's talk about building the right learning environment. This means creating a setting that cultivates learning. This will impact your methods, processes, and engagement considerations for all of your learners. These are several types of learning environments. First, there's classroom-based instruction. This is the most familiar style of training. It's a face-to-face interaction with an instructor and participants clearly defined. Even in this environment, though traditionally a one-way style of learning, it can be participatory, with a focus on more two-way interactive learning where participants are engaged and contributing to their learning process. The next one is coaching. This is typically another in-person training environment. The coach works with one person or a very small group of people to mentor them over time. The coach facilitates the individual or group's learning. This style can be very flexible and very responsive to the needs of the learner. The next one is online learning. This is a style of remote training that's typically web-based. Online content is delivered through a platform, a webinar, video, mobile application, for example. And the benefit is that the trainer and the participants can be in different locations and work on things sometimes at different times. The next one is blended learning. In this style, participants are trained using at least 2 modalities. By that we mean 2 different methods for learning. For example, participants could engage with online content in advance of a training, then participate in an in-person classroom-based training afterwards. Finally, the new one is microlearning. This is a method of learning that conveys information in short surges. It delivers knowledge in short, specific bursts, and this can be done with the aid of technology and really allows users to control what they learn. We can think about this as learn what you need or learn as you go. So if you need to know how to do a specific thing in a database, you can search for and find how to do just that specific thing instead of reading an entire manual. So let's talk about some learning approaches. When it comes to training, there's not just one approach that's effective at getting people to learn. To be effective, you really have to adapt to your audience. So we'll talk about 3 different approaches here: the behaviorist, cognitive, and humanist approach. As we're going through this, think about how this might apply in real life. The behaviorist approach is based on modeling, practice, and feedback. This can be modeling how to engage in case management or how to use a database. In order to encourage the use of good practices, participants need to see the direct consequence of using them. One way to do this is to give them practice using their own strategies and then require them to use the new strategy you're teaching in a limited way. The immediate and direct feedback that comes from this shows a faster and more efficient way to reach an outcome. And this is primarily through positive reinforcement. You can provide this in class. After modeling the behavior, you can give feedback on how it went and how the participant can improve. The next one is the cognitive approach. In this one, the trainer is the lead. They're the authority and the one who provides the knowledge. Participants are less engaged in this approach as the trainer is delivering the content and participants are listening. While this may sound less effective, there are times when this approach is really necessary and appropriate, for example, in discussions of compliance. The third approach is the humanist approach. This is all about participant involvement. The trainer is the subject matter expert, but gives the participants space to interpret and apply the materials. It has more of a coaching element to it. You can apply this, for example, by presenting a theory or a framework and giving participants a problem to solve using the theory base or framework. This approach is about highlighting and engaging in the process. In the spirit of engagement, I want you to think about what would be the best approach when it comes to several GBVIMS tools. So what kind of learning approach, behaviorist, cognitive, or humanist, would you use for the following tools? Classification tool, the intake form or incident recorder, and informed consent or case management. Let's look at the classification tool. If you thought approaching this like a behaviorist, that's great. This tool works well with a behaviorist approach because typically when we're training on it, we model what it looks like to do classification without a tool, and then what it looks like afterwards. We offer a lot of opportunities to practice, and we give specific, short feedback on each of those. This is a classic behaviorist approach. Next, the intake form or incident recorder. What approach would you use here? If you said cognitive, you're right. In this case, the trainer is providing knowledge, and because we all have to have the same understanding of the questions on the intake form or the way the incident recorder works, this one matches well with the cognitive approach. In this way, a trainer can walk through the intake form question by question and clarify what each of the component parts mean. Next, let's look at informed consent or training on case management. What approach would you use here? This one fits well with a humanist approach. Both informed consent and case management are all about the process, and the humanist approach is about digging into and practicing a concept in a practical way. You have a framework, you have guidance, but there's not one script or message to share in one particular way. It's more fluid and flexible, and a humanist approach will allow your participants to really engage with what they're learning, to try it out, and to develop their own process. Now let's talk about creating a learning culture. Learners have to be ready to learn in order to learn. That means that we have to create a culture that encourages that. This is about building the environment that will allow them to learn. This includes setting the goal for the session, setting an expectation that no one will be left behind, letting them know this is safe and that we value them taking risks and respecting others. To do this as trainers, we have to know a few things. First, everyone has the potential to learn. Don't give up on people and make sure they're encouraged throughout. This is particularly important, although it may seem obvious, to consider when we're training people on anything related to technology or very specific systems that have a certain way that they go forward, like the GBVIMS or GBVIMS Plus. It's easy when you're training someone on a computer system for people to fall behind and get frustrated. Technology has a way of pulling out our frustrations. So in this way, we need to slow down, think about those skills and characteristics of trainers, and approach them with patience and understanding and encouraging them throughout that they can learn this, to walk through the steps, to find points that they've already done well. So really focus on everyone having the potential to learn. If it helps, we've done trainings on the GBVIMS with people that have never touched a computer before and have successfully gone through. So really keep your focus on their potential to learn. Next, learning means you are changing, which means you're going from one state of something you knew to another. And this can bring about stress. So we need to make sure it feels safe. With that, if somebody gives a wrong answer during the training, we don't want to call them out or mock them or laugh at them. What we want to try and encourage is that they're speaking out, they're engaging, they're part of the process. And it's a process that requires change. So make sure that your learning environment is safe. Next, we want to encourage and support the exchange of ideas and opinions. This is especially important when we're looking at how adults learn. They need to be able to talk about their experiences before and relate them to the new content they're learning. So encourage an exchange of ideas and opinions in the room. Finally, we need to empower people. Provide them with so many opportunities to chime in and then celebrate it. This is where you can really shine as a trainer in being a cheerleader. So we've talked a little bit about how adults learn, but let's really dig into that more. There's a big difference between how children learn and adults. And we all have an experience as children, how we learned in a classroom setting, typically told by an authority figure what to know. But for adults, it's very different. It's important to know how adults learn to best train them. So here are some adult learning principles. First, tell them the why. Adults want to have explanations of why specific concepts are being taught in the first place. Next, check motivations. Adults are motivated to learn by a wide variety of factors. Some of the most common ones are personal aspirations, externally imposed expectations, internal desire or interest, escape from a situation, growth and advancement, and service to others. Adults have little time to learn new content for its own sake. Instead, they're interested in approaching tasks directly related to their occupation. So to thrive in most learning environments, you have to be clear on how each lesson fits into their goals for self-advancement. Next, allow for multiple learning preferences. Adults have preferences in the way that they learn. Some prefer to learn by doing, which is a kinesthetic style. Others prefer to learn by observing, which is a visual style. And while others prefer learning by listening, which is an auditory style. Try to include these different elements, these different learning preferences into your training. Then create space for collaboration. Adults learn best through collaboration and reciprocity. An environment where people learn with others while sharing what they already know is one that's going to really encourage a learning culture. Related to that, it's important to combine the new with the old. Adults bring life experience and knowledge to the learning environment. They learn best when they can relate new knowledge and information with previously learned knowledge and information. Learning needs to be self-directed. Adults tend to prefer to be self-directed or to have autonomous learning led by themselves. They prefer this approach because it allows for discovery on their own. As a general rule, adults need to be involved in planning their instruction and evaluating their results. Next, focus on short bursts. Research shows that learning in short spurts or bursts over a period of time at spaced out intervals improves long-term retention. Professionals learning on the job are further advantaged having the opportunity to reflect and repeatedly apply learning in real situations. So shortened, condensed learning opportunities are preferred to extend learning retention. If you think about it, it's easy to see how this is true. If you read an entire 300-page manual in one day, you might retain only 10 to 20% of that. But if you read one chapter each week, you're probably going to retain more of what you've learned. Next, whatever people are learning needs to be practical and have fast application. Adults want practical, goal-oriented, problem-centered learning that can immediately help them with life or work challenges. They typically respond best to learning that's centered around performing common tasks. So if you can in your training say, this will make your job easier, or this will reduce your time spent on this, that's something that's going to be quickly applicable. Adults will prefer that. And finally, feedback is queen. Adults desire feedback on the process they're making at learning something new, so provide feedback often. Now, let's get into some high-level looks at the details of planning and implementation for a training. To be an effective trainer, you need to do many things. First, you need to assess the needs. You need to start by identifying ways to measure our participants' skill development. So most often, we do this with a pre-test and a post-test. So we can see at the beginning where people are at, or they can fill out an application, or you know from working in the office with them where they're kind of at and where you want them to be. You need to design the training. So sometimes we get trainings in a facilitator's manual or some other guidance that's been done in advance by a specialist. But often we're better off if we adapt this, or at least review the content and contextualize it to our setting or align it with our specific intended outcomes and objectives. In other words, don't just read the PowerPoint that's given to you, but really learn it and make it something that's familiar for you. Next, we need to prepare. So we need to develop a training plan, which includes needed resources, session plans, and timing. Then you need to know the fundamentals. So understand participant expectations, align their expectations with the training objectives, and then prepare the core content. This will make sure that you have alignment from the beginning to the end. Next, be aware of learning barriers. It's important for you to prepare for different levels of understanding and potentials for pushback. The more that you can prepare in advance, the better off you'll be when you're on site doing a training. Next, obviously, we need to implement the training. This is under execution. So try to focus on ways to train participants that will aid in their application of learning. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through the next pages. Next, you need to focus on transferring learning competency. So utilize activities and training materials that will help participants apply what they've learned. This can be role plays, simulations, or other interactive elements. In this way, what they learn will be better retained. And then finally, it's our job to continually be improving when we're doing these kind of trainings. So the last step is to evaluate and refine. Monitor the progress of the training according to your objectives, according to learning uptake, and then apply revisions to the materials. You can do this on the spot, or you can do it in reflection after the training has been completed. What we're looking for are opportunities to improve our teaching methods, the training materials, and way to better meet participant learning needs to ensure that those skills are transferred when the training is complete. Let's talk a little bit more about developing learning objectives. Adults, for the most part, want to know where they're going before they get there. And this is also true when we think about learning. Setting objectives for a training can seem quite simple, but we can give it a bit of structure with the ABCD method. So A, get to know your audience. This is one of the most important parts of this entire training. Knowing your audience is a key element of your success. Next, define the behavior you want to see. Then C, under what conditions? So what are the tools, aids, or materials that the user can use? And finally, what is the degree of knowledge they require? Effective trainers use learning objectives to measure participant performance. This helps us keep focused on the core concepts to assess throughout the course. Even if you get a prepared set of training materials, a good trainer will review and adapt those materials according to the ABCD method. The session plan will look at the activities and resources needed to train on the objectives. Some key elements to think about with your training sessions are: first, defining the session objectives and what participants must learn to complete. Next, clarifying the key topics and related concepts. Then ensuring that you have a variety of learning approaches covered, engaging participants using several different approaches and applying them in different ways. This will help them retain the information. Being creative and using a variety of tools such as plenary and group discussions, role plays, group teaching, online tools will better get at the various different learning preferences from your participants. Then include ways to assess what participants are actually learning. Make time to build methods into the plan to check their learning progress. The best trainers typically pre-assess participants on what they know and then continually assess them during the session and at the end. Finally, think about the timing of your sessions. Some concepts or skills may take more time to master than others. Identify these skills up front and incorporate extra time for participants to absorb or practice the material. If you have an upcoming training, you could take this time to look at the module or modules of the training and outline a session plan. So let's dig deeper into the training itself. There are 9 steps to delivering instruction, according to Robert Gagne, who wrote The Conditions of Learning. Let's talk about each of these. The first one in delivering a training is to gain the attention of your students. So first, start by ensuring learners are ready to learn and participate in activities by getting their attention. This could include novelty, uncertainty, or surprise, posing thought-provoking questions, or starting off your session with a case study. Find a way to hook them in. Next, inform students of the objectives. So learners need to know the intended outcomes to help them understand what they will learn and the value of it. Next, stimulate recall of prior learning. So help students make sense of new information by relating it to something they already know or something they've already experienced. You can do this by asking questions about their previous experiences or asking them about their understanding of previous concepts. Next, you need to present the content. So how is what they're learning now different from what they had in the past? Use strategies to present and cue lesson content to provide more effective, efficient instruction. You can organize and chunk content in a meaningful way, providing explanations after demonstrations. You can do this by providing examples, presenting it in multiple different modalities. That could be video, lecture, podcast, group work, role plays. Then provide guidance. So advise students about strategies to aid them in learning content and also of the resources available to them. You can provide instructional support as needing. This would be scaffolds, which could include cues, hints, prompts, that then can be removed after the student learns the task or the content. You could think about this like guiding questions. You can model varied learning strategies like mnemonics, concept mapping, role-playing, visualizing. You could use examples and non-examples. So in addition to providing examples, non-examples help students see what not to do or the opposite of examples. As always, case studies, analogies, visual images, and metaphors are all really helpful. They help students understand this in real-world application, and analogies also have a way of helping them retain information over a longer period of time. For those that like to learn visually, visual images can help them make visual associations. Then you'll elicit performance, so give them time to practice. Using the guidance on the spot and applying that will also aid in retention. While they're doing that, you can also move on to the next step, which is providing feedback. So while your learners are practicing, you can provide immediate feedback on their performance to assess and facilitate learning. There are several different kinds of feedback that you could use. Confirmatory feedback, which means informing the learner what they did, what they were supposed to do. Corrective or remedial feedback, which means informing the learner about the accuracy of their performance or response, kind of steering them back. Remedial feedback can mean directing the learner in the right direction or correcting an answer or leading them to it, but not providing the exact answer. You can give them informative feedback, which is providing information that's new, different, additions, suggestions to the learner to confirm that you've been actively listening to them. And finally, you can give them analytical feedback, providing the learner with suggestions, recommendations, and information for them to correct their performance on their own. After this, you'll assess their performance. So this could be a test, a quiz, having the learner walk you through the steps, in order to evaluate the effectiveness of the session. You have to test to see if the expected learning outcomes have been achieved. You can do this through a pre and post test to check for mastery of content or skills, or you could embed questions throughout the instruction through oral questioning or quizzes. Finally, you need to enhance retention and help them transfer it to the job. To help learners develop expertise, they must internalize this new knowledge. So this is the follow-up to see if they're applying what they have learned. This goes back to the coaching approach, in that you can follow up with someone a week later, a month later, 6 months later, to see how they've applied the concepts that they've learned. So at times, this process can seem a bit rigid. These steps of instruction are far more applicable to something like training on an information system over more theoretical concepts. Let's talk a little bit more about giving feedback. This is a really crucial part of trainings and one that's often missing, and it's really difficult to do it right. So let's talk about some guidelines for feedback. Rule number 1, don't go overboard. When a participant repeatedly struggles, it's tempting to want to give them a lot of praise when they achieve some level of success, but this can actually do more harm than good. For starters, insincere praise is easy to detect. What's more, too much praise can convey a sense of low expectation, and as a result can be demotivating. Rule number 2, correct quietly. Constructive feedback given in front of others, even if well-intended, can be read as a public attack on them and their ability. This can lead to developing a sense of fear of failure, or participants can feel disempowered. One way to overcome this is to speak to the individual privately. This limits the attention drawn to the feedback while getting them the message across clearly. Rule number 3, be specific. When we say something is good, we often assume that people will know exactly what about it was good. This is not always the case. The more detailed and specific your feedback, the better. This removes ambiguity and specifically reinforces what you want the participant to do more of. Rather than saying good work, you could say something like, you did ABC in the correct steps very well. Rule number 4, focus on process, not natural ability. Praising effort instead of intelligence increases intrinsic motivation and provides a template for participants to follow the next time. Rule number 5, combine open and closed questions. Closed questions limit you to a yes or no answer and don't really identify opportunities for you as a trainer to step in and help. Effective trainers provide feedback through a combination of open and closed questions. Closed statements convey key information and focus the conversation, while open ones help to solicit better understanding of a situation. Rule number 6, end with clear action points. Clear action points. Any feedback you provide that doesn't lead to a change in behavior is ineffective. So what do you want them to do differently? Make sure this is clear. Let's talk more about effective engagement. Communication is the key element of an effective training. In this, it's important to remember the audience is more important than the topic. If you don't structure your content around your audience, their retention will suffer. Effective trainers structure their messages into 3 buckets. These are planning, preparing, and presenting. First, you have to plan what you're going to say. This is often ignored because many trainers will say, there's no need to plan, it's all written in the course content. The best trainers, however, address three core elements in their messages, which include knowing their audience and their needs, knowing the message to deliver, and knowing how to deliver the message. For example, assume that I'm training a group of experienced M&E staff with new tools. I know they're experienced, so I'll explain how the tool will improve their efforts by demonstrating it using the tool rather than explaining it in PowerPoint. Whereas if I'm explaining the system to senior level staff without exposure to these tools or background knowledge, I can keep the content more high level to match their end needs for the information. The next step is to actually prepare the message you're going to say. Your role is to interpret the content to align with the needs of the audience. If you don't do this, participants will get lost if the content is too complex, or they'll lose interest if it's something they already know. Either way, this is because the trainer didn't prepare or adapt the message appropriately. Finally, you're now in a position to present your message. When you're presenting, think about 3 items. 1, how will you speak to the content? 2, how will you coordinate your body language with the message? And 3, what type of visual support will help you show your message? There's an increasing expectation for engagement and interactivity in training. Rightfully so, because this is how people learn, through active engagement. So here are some ways to increase participant involvement. First, choose appropriate engagement techniques. From a simple show of hands to role-playing, games, and small group exercises, cater the types of engagement to your audience and your intended outcomes. Next, plan ahead. Before asking for participation, think about the types of responses or reactions you might get. You want participants to gain meaningful insight within the activities and to help make your point. Most importantly, think about what you'll do if you don't get the responses you expect. Next, include participants in a way they can relate. When asking questions, ask them in such a way that most participants can respond. Asking something like, "Tell me about the challenges to complete a job task," is something that everyone can relate and respond to. These inclusive questions are great for building a shared identity among the crowd. Next, allow participants time to engage. Whatever your learning activity, it's important to give people time to engage. This means actually giving them time to absorb what you're saying or asking, and then time for them to attempt a response. Acknowledge contributions. People want to be valued, and your participants want to be involved. A simple act of acknowledgement will value their contribution, motivate them and others to get more involved. And finally, don't be afraid to experiment. You may be surprised how the simplest of activities can and will engage your participants. So I'd like to give you time to think about methods or activities you've utilized to encourage participation. Here are some examples. You can look around the whole group and avoid looking too much at one specific individual. Stand up when you speak, especially at the beginning of a session. Move around without distracting the group. Use gestures and actions to keep the group lively and focused or to show your affection. Speak slowly and clearly. And help the participants do most of the talking. Ask questions that make participants talk, such as, "What do you think about?" or "Why?" or "How?" or "What if?" If someone answers with a simple yes or no, ask him or her to elaborate. Paraphrase. Occasionally rephrasing people's thoughts and feelings in your own words and check in with them to ensure you've correctly understood what they said. For example, you could say, "So what you're saying is..." Next, tell your stories. Use appropriate self-disclosure by the trainer to create trust between the group and yourself. They'll be much more likely to share their own stories if you share yours. Next, focus on listening. This is your opportunity to validate, clarify, restate, reflect, especially when you think you may disagree. When people put a question to you as the expert, make a practice of inviting others to respond first by putting the question to the group as a whole. You'll often be surprised how much wisdom resides within the group. Next, you can draw on others to avoid a battle. If you find yourself being criticized by a participant or in strong disagreement with what they're saying, it's often helpful to invite the comments of the rest of the group before commenting yourself. Next, do temperature check-ins. What we mean by this is checking in with the group relatively frequently regarding their interest level or their understanding of what you're presenting. You can also bring out quiet participants and address participants who talk too much, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Then help bring out views that are not fully expressed or represented. And of course, you can always do a quick energizer if it looks like the group is lowing in energy. So we've gone through some engagement activities, but I want to talk a little bit about nonverbal cues. It's important that you can read the room or read the audience. People will say a lot without saying anything out loud. The difference between the words people say and how we understand what they're saying comes from nonverbal communication, also known as body language. And if you've been training for some time, you recognize how participants react and receive the content more through body language than their verbal responses. Engaging your audience is in your control, so you need to be alert to the disengagement signs and signals. Some signs and signals include a person's head being down, their eyes are glazed, or they're gazing at something else. They might seem distracted, or they might be fiddling with items around them. Their body might not be upright or confident. Ultimately, it's up to you to re-engage participants by doing something like asking a person a direct question or changing the activity. And while this is going on, make sure your body language shows that you're engaged as well. 46 years ago, a psychologist named Paul Ekman decided that he wanted to see if Darwin was right that people of all ages and races from all over the world show emotions the same way. He traveled the globe with photographs that showed faces experiencing 6 basic emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise. Everywhere he went, from Japan to Brazil to the remotest villages of Papua New Guinea, he asked subjects to look at these faces and to identify the emotions they saw on them. To do so, they had to pick from a set list of options represented to them by Ekman. And the results were impressive. Everybody, it turned out, even people who'd never seen a foreigner before in their lives, matched the same emotions to the faces. But as it turns out, reading cues on faces is not so simple. More recent science says that it may be more difficult because, no surprise, there are a lot of other factors that are involved in determining what someone is feeling. So it might be more difficult to tell the difference between happiness and surprise because of cultural differences, for example. What we can know, though, typically, is if what they're feeling on their face is good, indicating happiness, or bad, which could include sadness, fear, disgust, contempt. That's something a lot of us can read with nonverbal cues. These are some examples. If this was a live video, we could go through these together. And again, this might look a little bit different depending on where you're from and your experiences. But if you wanted to follow along, you can guess of the 6 core emotional types that people are saying with their body language. So which one of these pictures is happiness? Which one's sadness? Surprise? Anger? Disgust? Contempt? You don't need to be totally right, but if you can at least tell if someone is happy or sad, if it's a positive or negative feeling, that's a good start. And if you want to know the answers, from the top left to the bottom right, it's happiness, surprise, contempt, on the bottom row, sadness, anger, and disgust. Let's talk about different styles of learners and how to respond to that. At times in trainings, there's a participant that dominates the discussion. This is likely an extroverted participant, someone who's outgoing, quick to make decisions, and likes to be in group settings. However, we need to make sure our training also responds to introverted learning, those who like more time to process what they're learning and may not be energized by learning in a group setting. A good trainer needs to make sure that all participants have opportunities to contribute. They could invite introverted participants by name or split the group into smaller groups. If you have one dominant participant, you can also use humor by saying something like, "I know you have the answer, but let's hear from the rest of the group." This encourages that person, but also gives a gentle nudge to allow space for others to contribute. Trainers will also encounter participants that may be reluctant to talk or express their views in a group. The trainer can either put those people in smaller groups or ask people to discuss questions first in pairs. They can also use other practical activities such as mind mapping, ranking, timelines to help people express their views. Writing activities or ones where everyone has to participate in some structured way can encourage their engagement. The trainer can also encourage these individuals individually, within or outside of the group. But the most effective way in encouraging people who are shy is to refer back to and use their ideas so they know they're important and valued. Cross-cultural communication is an important consideration for our work. There are 3 key elements to consider to help you be a better, more inclusive trainer. And again, you need to know your audience. This includes several considerations, such as language skills. Reading, writing, listening, and speaking are all different communication skills. Do not assume each participant can perform all skills in their non-native language. To aid with this, use simpler language. Put extra content in handouts and PowerPoint. And you can also provide handouts in advance and encourage participants to read through and ask questions. Next, consider interaction methods. One big difference between cultures is the method of interaction and engagement. Try not to rely on one method like role plays or lecture. Instead, employ a variety of methods to increase the opportunity for better engagement. Find activities that allow for native language discussion. For example, participants can do work in small groups in native languages and then report back to the group in the operational or working language. Finally, flexibility. This is where adaptability comes in as a handy skill for trainers. If a method of instruction is not working, pivot to another to help participants engage. Now we're going to talk about working with difficult participants. If you haven't seen the video here, it's a funny example of training with difficult conditions. You can Google BBC Child Interrupts Interview if you want to watch it. It's unlikely to be the kind of interruptions you'll deal with, but the takeaway message is that you should be prepared. So how do we manage difficult participants? Skilled trainers learn how to handle interruptions on the fly when they occur. And here's some advice on how to do that. First, know what might throw you off and prepare. Anticipate the 5 or 6 most difficult questions you may face and rehearse how you'll deal with them. You may not always have an answer, but you'll be able to respond appropriately. Content preparation is one aspect, but equally relevant is how you react to the questions as well. Avoid these 3 nonverbal reactions. First, nervously reacting because you don't know how to respond. This nonverbal cue communicates weakness and undermines your credibility. Second, responding arrogantly to show off your mastery of the topic. This nonverbal response intimidates participants and inhibits them from asking other questions. And finally, responding with annoyance. This response subtly communicates that the participant's concern is insignificant. The second way to deal with interruptions is to do what can be called meet, greet, and target. You can do this with participants before starting the session. Saying hello informally gets you to make personal connections with participants. By meeting and greeting them, asking pointed questions like, what do you do? And what would you like to take away from the session? Is one way to mitigate potential interruptions and to target those who may prove to be a challenge. The third aspect, and one many trainers fear the most, is dealing with a difficult participant. There's always that one person that will challenge you, and we'll come back to this one. If we were live, I would suggest you test this out by choosing a topic of your training and writing up 2 to 3 of the most difficult questions you might get from participants, then preparing your answers. We'll end with a little game of matchup, matching the type of difficult participant with the best way to respond. There are 4 types of difficult participants: the distractor, the heckler, the interrupter, and the questioner. I'll give you a minute to read through the ways to respond to these people on the right-hand side. Then we can match them up. Okay, let's try this out. For the questioner, what's important is to deal with this quickly. You can choose a diversity of participants to ask or answer questions. You can also respond with, I know you have an answer. Let's hear from the rest of the group. For the distractor, while presenting, either stop and move towards that person or stop speaking. Look at the person and ask if there's a question or something they'd like to share. For the interrupter, you can diffuse this by calmly explaining that you have a lot of ground to cover. You can offer to speak with them after. Finally, for the heckler, you can try the other methods or use a witty retort. You can always respond neutrally by reflecting back their statement as, "What I hear you saying is." Overall, it's important to respond confidently. We've covered a lot in this video. What I hope you took away were the skills and characteristics of good trainers, that setting up the right environment is a key element of your training success. Looking at a high-level overview of planning and implementation, and also some tips and ideas on how to effectively engage and communicate with participants. Thank you.